The King of Podcasts Radio Network proudly presents the Wrestling is Real podcast, because wrestling needs us. If you would have told me back on March 26, 2001, after Nitro had its last episode, 3 days after WWF purchased WCW, and you told me that somewhere down the line in the future, we would get wrestling back on TBS, because TBS was running Thunder at the time, and March 21st was their last episode. So think about that. If you told me that we were going to get wrestling back 20 years later, 20 years and roughly 6 months after the fact, well, here we are. It happened. Hell is frozen over in the world of professional wrestling. AEW will continue to be on the Turner networks, but they'll be moving their show to TBS, which I like to refer to as the Superstation. Superstation TBS. It's amazing. Literally, when we used to have so many years of wrestling on TBS, I know that the channel is nothing like it was, but the fact that Ted Turner had brought wrestling on in 1972 to TBS, back when it was just WTBS, and was just on Channel 17 on the UHF band, and you're thinking, okay, here it comes back, and nobody has a second thought about it. We're just saying to ourselves, oh, wow. You know, we always watched Turner Time, 5 minutes after the hour, 6:05 Eastern on Saturdays. And to see TBS getting wrestling again after the bullshit of the AOL Time Warner deal, and Jamie Kellner, remember that name, we're going to talk about him a little bit later on the program, Jamie Kellner, and the ultimate decision to cut WCW. Yes, it was a loss leader. Yes, it was one of the parts of the entire AOL Time Warner merger. One of the properties that was failing miserably. You are correct. But it was making money a couple years before. We all know the story of WCW. We've all read it. Again, if you need to read a great book about it, I'm not going to tell you the Brian Alvarez book. No, I'm going to tell you the Guy Evans book on Nitro. That's a great book. I might even have to go back and listen to it again, because that story was such an amazing thing. And the Turner executives and the way that WCW was run and the accounting and all the efforts that were done back then. And it's almost kismet that the Dusty Rhodes' son, Cody, in some way, shape, or form, is going to be responsible in part for the fact that we're getting wrestling back on TBS. I just think it's a wonderful thing. It's as if the circumvention, the pendulum of wrestling, is now back in place. Nothing wrong with seeing AEW on TNT, but we know the decision's being made more for a sports programming decision. It's nothing of a drop-off. It's really just a linear change. It's just a parallel shift over. Paradigm shift, if you will. That's pretty much what this is. We're going to talk about the symbolism of this deal and what it means in terms of wrestling in the history of it. Because I think there's a lot of things that need to be understood as to why this is important, why it's good. We're going to talk about that. And I'll take some time to go and talk about WrestleMania Backlash. But if you want to hear about that, I did a full review over at WrestlingIsReal.com. My last episode 613, is a recap of WrestleMania Backlash. I also talk about Impact Wrestling's Under Siege, and it's all there. But then this news broke today. We're going to talk about it now, and I want to go through the history of the fact that wrestling's coming back to a station that everyone is very familiar with for 6 decades now. Getting wrestling back on the air on this one particular channel, which has given me a lot of fond memories as a kid to a teenager. I love TBS. I have not watched TBS in this current form. When they dropped Superstation, I haven't watched it. Or actually, I really never watched TBS since they moved WCW off of there. Because I used to watch Just Thunder and I would watch some other things, but for the most part, TBS was a pretty cool station into the 2000s. But then we saw they were changing everything up, and TNT also made some changes. They made a lot of significant programming changes. Because TBS, for me, you had Andy Griffith at night, usually at 7:35 or something like that. Sanford to Son at 7:05. You usually had some movie going on either in the afternoon or you'd catch one at night, 8:05 Eastern. It was an interesting time. TBS was an interesting channel. It's one of those goofy little superstations, much like USA Network was back in the day, because it gave you everything. It was just a hodgepodge of all these different things that were going on. It's fascinating. But a lot of things are going on. A lot of pieces that need to be discussed are really, I think, are the catalysts as to why this move was made. But this is a good move. And the reason I talk about TBS and the symbolism of it is because of some of the changes that are going to be made as a result. So we're going to go right first into Deadline.com, which is where I read the story first. I'm going to bring that up right now. So AEW Dynamite is shifting to TBS in 2022 as All Elite Wrestling's franchise program expands with a new program, AEW Rampage. So the decision is this. Now, Turner said Wednesday that TNT's wrestling series AEW Dynamite will move to TBS in January 2022. TNT will be adding, for the meantime, the new hour-long series AEW Rampage, which will debut on Fridays beginning August 13th at 10 p.m. Eastern. And then that show will also move to TBS with Dynamite in 2022. So AEW, its broadcast home will be TBS. Dynamite is currently in the middle of Season 3 on TNT. The show will remain on Wednesday nights when it relocates to TBS, and this is according to a press call that Brent White, general manager of TBS, True TV, and TNT, confirmed this morning. Quote, both TBS and TNT have an incredibly storied past with wrestling, so for us being able to put more AEW onto TBS was a natural fit. For me, being able to program these networks as a portfolio gives me the latitude to put them where it makes most sense for the consumer. Did the NHL have anything to do with it? Sure. The NBA had something to do with it. We felt TBS had an opportunity to be the best platform for expansion. As we know, AEW has their broadcast deal through 2023. So, as promised, the new hour of programming is now being set into place. We have no clue what AEW Rampage is going to become. And the other word we also learned about is that Fridays at 10 o'clock right now is where they're going to have that show on the schedule. But that does not mean that AEW Rampage will be permanently placed there when it moves to TBS. TNT, in addition, will debut 4 new pro wrestling specials as part of the new deal announced today, which will culminate AEW's move with TBS next year. Sam Linsky, Assistant General Manager, Senior Vice President of Programming and Operations at TBS, TNT, and True TV, said that, quote, it's a pleasure to be able to help Tony Khan expand his wrestling fiefdom across our networks and bring more content to our fans that fits the thrill ride brand of TNT and good time of TBS. Now, keep this in mind. Let's put this all together. So TBS will have AEW Dynamite on Wednesday nights. They'll have the new AEW Dynamite show coming up as well, which will start on TNT in August, then move over with Dynamite on TBS in January. And TNT will continue to have AEW programming in the form of 4 wrestling specials. This is very similar to what we used to have a particular series, which used to happen 4 times a year. We only had a handful of pay-per-views a year. We're now getting what is basically the same. It basically is the form of Clash of the Champions. We're basically getting that programming back. So the format that the Crockett's had years ago, where they used to run Clash of the Champions specials on TBS. So it were basically were pay-per-views, pay-per-view quality programs that are run on cable television as opposed to putting them on pay-per-view. There are now going to be 4 seasonal specials. And we'll have the 4 pay-per-views a year. That basically gives us 8 when you look at it. And 4 of them, we're watching them on regular TV without having to pay a subscription fee. That's pretty good. AEW Dynamite was the #1 program on Wednesday, May 5th among adults 18 to 49, a first for the wrestling franchise. And TNT also said it garnered its most watched episode, 1.2 million viewers, since the series launched in October 2019. And Tony Khan also was interviewed by Deadline.com. He says, quote, "As a lifelong wrestling aficionado who is privileged to present AEW to longtime and new fans alike, it means a lot to me, personally and professionally, to share the news that All Elite Wrestling will call TBS home in wrestling for wrestling in 2022. Also, he puts himself down as CEO, GM, and head of creative AEW. Quote, "The history of wrestling in the United States cannot be told without acknowledging the contributions of TBS, which is WTBS years ago, delivered wrestling to the Southeast and eventually to a massive national audience. TBS has the same passion for wrestling today, but will offer AEW and our fans more primetime programming, content, and global opportunities that will establish TBS as the world's undisputed destination for wrestling." That is great. Tony Khan gets the symbolism of this. There is something to be said as a lifelong wrestling fan like I have to appreciate this move here. No doubt the #2 promotion now in wrestling on television in America. It is not the level of New Japan, and there are probably some other promotions that might be a little bit bigger than them, but to American wrestling fans, it's the #2 promotion right now. Hands down. So let's get a little more information as to what this all means. The Ringer actually put a whole story together. Well, there's a few different places I look at this. One of the reasons this move was made is going to be on account of a new merger in the corporate media world. This is where my Broadcasters podcast comes on. I'm going to have to explain this to all of you wrestling fans out there, so you have to understand. There was a merger that was announced for $45 billion, where Warner Media, which owns TBS, TNT, and True TV, and other properties, they're going to be merging into Discovery, which, of course, Discovery owns, Nat Geo. There's a lot. I got to go and explain all that in a second. But Discovery is another major network. Discovery Channel, Animal Planet, and a number of channels underneath their helm. So let's talk about that. This new media company would be now the biggest player in the streaming landscape. So let's go into what this is. So the Warner Media-Discovery merger is bad business, but likely terrific news for consumers. So I read $45 billion. In this story, it says it's $43 billion. It's a U-turn for AT&T, which acquired Time Warner in 2018 for $85 billion. AT&T sought the acquisition to get a part of content. So AT&T, we know them as they do cell phone service, they do internet, they do cable. They own DirecTV. They own a lot of things. The way you watch programming, you probably have something that you use that's connected to AT&T. It's a big telecommunications company. They also got into the game of broadcasting by buying media properties. Okay? So AT&T gained control of HBO, CNN, Warner Brothers, and that's everything. So Warner Brothers Pictures, animation, all of that. TBS, DC Comics, yes, the DC Universe is underneath Warner Media, and several other iconic mass media brands. The new division oversees properties that were dubbed Warner Media, launching the streaming service HBO Max, which some of you might have subscribed to house all the content. Now, getting into the story here, Warner Media will then merge with Discovery to create a vast and compelling catalog that can not only compete with Netflix and Disney, but beat them. The idea is this is content to build Discovery, which has Discovery Plus, to build a new platform that will be as big as Netflix, as big as Hulu, as big as Amazon Prime, as big as Apple Plus. Apple TV Plus. And if you like to, you can go and listen to my Broadcasters podcast tomorrow. I'll probably bring this story up on that show as well, just to give you the heads up. So what you have underneath this new company, you also have Cartoon Network, Adult Swim, Cinemax, TBS, TNT, and then the Discovery Network includes HGTV, the Food Network, TLC, the Oprah Winfrey Network, Animal Planet, and the Discovery Channel. So this is just a big merger of all these different TV, cable projects, all these cable channels, all merging together in one, and being able to provide digital content to said companies. So let's move along here. That's really what this is going on. So we're having this merger come into play, which is going to let people really understand. You have to... The deal was made here with AEW prior to the merger. As the merger has been announced, Warner Media was actually just doing some things to help reorganize themselves as they're planning things out. Now, Warner Media has also been doing their own work because Turner Sports and Bleacher Report are part of the merger with Discovery. And certain deals and certain parameters are being put in place in preparation for the new merger. So the fact that AEW was involved in a shuffle here prior to the merger, so that they're locked in some place, because when the new team comes in, they're going to be able to go and perform under this new contract through 2023, have themselves on TBS, have themselves on a spot where they're going to be all set. Turner Sports gets their ducks in a row. Bleacher Report, in the same vein, also gets their ducks in a row in preparation for new management to come in and probably start making some changes, but not without having their properties being put into place. Now, to give some more context, Discovery Networks, or Discovery Media, they actually have their own sports franchises. So let's give all this so you can understand. So the idea is to create a strong direct-to-consumer platform that'll be bigger than what Netflix and NBC Universal, and second only to Disney, as the second biggest media company in the U.S. Let's put that into perspective. The AEW will be with a company, they're going to be associated with a company that's bigger. They're now with a major media conglomerate. So Warner Media was in this spot, and now they got picked up, and now they're going to be one of the biggest media companies in the world. So the level of the fact that this property has now been locked in on a long-term deal, this deal right now through 2023, they can also promote the fact they're going to be part, and they're going to have this cross-promotion through all these channels. Think about this, too. The opportunities for that are endless. Cross-promotion for all this inventory that they have, it's advertising that they have in all these channels. Think about AEW getting a chance to be promoted on HDTV or Food Network or TLC or Animal Planet, all these different places to get new viewers or to promote new products, because obviously AEW is not afraid to go and promote other businesses or promote other programming. They've done it for TBS, they've done it for TNT, they've done it for Warner Brothers movies, they've done it for programming that was going to be on HBO Max. So they're not afraid of doing all this. AEW is more than welcome to cross-promote and to work with their fellow other broadcast networks or their fellow cable networks to work in a collective effort to promote. Now, here's the other part that's very important. Internationally, this is extremely important. So Warner Brothers owns TNT and TBS. They jointly operate the NBA, NBA Media, which collectively broadcasts NBA, Major League Baseball, March Madness, and a new deal recently for the NHL, which is the reason, in part, why AEW is moving over to TBS. Discovery owns Eurosport. It's a major carrier of sports internationally, holding rights to various pro soccer and basketball leagues, the Olympics, tennis, and motorsports. So with that, the fact that AEW can be carried to a global audience is now even better so than creating the individual deals that Warner Media or Turner Sports could be able to do for AEW. This new relationship with Discovery opens up the door to a large international presence. Keep that in mind. There's a whole lot more to be said about what this really means, but these couple of stories really explain everything that's going on with the change now and why it's so important for all of this to happen. Now, The Wrap also put out a story that really gave a good explanation as to why the change happened. This is from a broadcasting site. Brett White's, we already know, we spoke about why. So let's go into a little bit more. As much as AEW fans have gotten used to wrestling on Wednesdays, primetime hockey traditionally occupied the same evening on the soon-to-be-defunct NBC Sports Network. And as we know, NBA games, if you didn't know, they air Tuesdays and Thursdays on TNT, and the plan always called for a new all-elite hour not to be paired with Dynamite. While Rampage will move to TBS with Dynamite, it has not been determined if the third hour will remain on Friday nights following the move. To reiterate the point of the 4 specials, TNT will have those specials annually. You might refer to those as pay-per-views, to use an old cable term that still gets thrown around professional wrestling. The Supercard event, this is what AEW CEO Tony Khan's term, will stay on TNT even after the weekly shows move to TBS. Now here they offer more commentary from Tony Khan. He says, quote, "And while we're looking forward to our arrival on TBS, we're not saying goodbye to our original and current home of TNT. The financial upside to our new agreement gives us the opportunity to continue to invest in and grow AEW to serve the most important people in our industry, our fans, our wrestlers, our staff, and our sponsors. With All Elite Wrestling, Dynamite, and Rampage taking center stage via our new agreement on TBS next year, the new quarterly supercards launching on TNT, our exposure and our opportunities to grow AEW are greater than ever." This is another big power move by AEW. The live events and getting those back on board was a big step. This broadcasting step, this is getting papered and getting promoted. There's a lot of coverage of this across the board. If you even did a search for WCW TBS, the AEW Dynamite story comes right up. WWE needs to be concerned. This is great press for AEW. It's legitimizing them once again throughout all major corporate business, all major media. They're looking at AEW. It's on the map. It's there. There was nothing bad to be said about this decision. This is, in essence, an enhanced agreement because now they're getting the extra hour as planned. They're getting the 4 quarterly specials. That's new. So there's going to have to be some kind of an additional carriage that TNT, TBS, Warner Media itself is going to pay AEW to offer more quarterly programming like they're going to do with those TNT specials. So they must be making more money off of this altogether. Then the merger with Discovery opens the door to full international coverage to get this company global, if it isn't already. So they're in Europe, they're probably in Asia, they're probably reaching other markets, but you're talking about Discovery opening the door to so much more. And this is a Turner company that was not run under Ted Turner like it was back in the day. It's a much different company. They're going to get the same kind of corporate structure, resources, and wherewithal. And so many different brands to promote underneath them. They're going to be used for so much cross-promotion. They're going to be able to utilize so much cross-promotion. They're going to be able to do so much when it comes to their advertising efforts. You can't go wrong here. AEW is being looked at as a wrestling property, much like a sports property, and they're treating them pretty respectfully. This was a major decision. And everyone needs to take notice that AEW is on the map. It's amazing how short of a time they have gotten this far. Where we are now. 2.5 years later. Who'd have thought? And more importantly than that, Who thought that this company was going to go ahead, after everything that happened to them, that they were going to make their way back to TBS, to a station synonymous with professional wrestling? It's incredible. For almost 30 years, TBS was synonymous. They were the pioneers of professional wrestling. Because remember, the first people to see professional wrestling in a national landscape on cable was TBS. And do we need to go through the whole story of TBS and everything that's gone on with it? Even the delvings of Vince McMahon in his early onset to go and conquer professional wrestling, be the top wrestling promotion in the world. He had to go through this kind of thing here. And he brought himself to this mix. So AEW is not going to be WCW. We've been around here long enough to see what they've been doing. And as far as I'm concerned, regardless of the rumors are saying that the EVPs are not talking to each other, there's some infighting. I don't know about that. The show is consistently good. Whatever's going on right now, another good Dynamite. They're prepping up for Double or Nothing coming up on the 30th. It's great. I love it. They'll be on Friday night next week. They're doing a lot of good. They're not perfect, but they're doing a lot of things right. And I support and I endorse the move that are going to make to TBS. I think it's a great thing. And I really hope that I hear Shivani or Jim Ross, one of them, drop the Superstation reference on there. Please. I hope they do a throwback night. That they're going to be on TBS. I would love to see Tony Schiavone get back behind that old studio. Let's get a Pinnacle or an Inner Circle promo back behind the desk. Give us that whole look. I want to see that. I want to see that look. I don't know why, but for some reason I want to see that look. I want to get that kind of look of everything going on with the show. I'd love to have a throwback night. Give me an old NWA feel of a night and do something like that where it's on TBS. Hell, get NWA involved. And then you can use all the old, you can use the new iconography. That's how it says. Get that all together. Get with Billy Corgan. Do one night, NWA throwback night. And make it for an AEW Dynamite special. Give me one night where we get a little bit of a throwback. Just one. I know it's a lot to ask, but I'd love to see that sometime. It's one of those few things I'd like to go and have. But this is indicative. Go back to 2001, 20 years ago. Almost 20 years and roughly 59 days. 20 years and almost 2 months to the day. Where we saw the drop of Turner Sports dropping WCW. And thus taking wrestling off of TBS for the first time. For me, it was a sad day as a wrestling fan. I hated seeing it. So let me go ahead and pull this story from the New York Times. They reported on it. We go back to March 19, 2001. New York Times. Turner Broadcasting System, division of AOL Time Warner, which was what it was at the time, will stop showing professional wrestling on TNT and its TBS cable channels. The cancellation of wrestling, this is in March 19, 2001, marked the end of an era at Turner Broadcasting. The cable franchise built by Ted Turner, which TBS might not be the same, but it still holds true today. There's something about that channel, something special about being on that channel, having wrestling on that channel, because they were the first. That was Ted Turner. His vision returns. Now, Ted Turner started showing matches of World Championship Wrestling on his first TV station, WTCG, TV 17 in Atlanta, in the early 1970s. He later used wrestling to attract viewers to TBS and TNT, and was one of the only people, if you read the books by Brian Alvarez and R.D. Reynolds, or the book by Guy Evans, we know that Ted Turner was basically the only person supporting and defending the right to have wrestling on television, on their channels. The league had fallen on hard times. Though it was at one point the dominant wrestling franchise on television in the last couple of years, it has consistently lost in the ratings to the World Wrestling Federation, which was first on USA Network and later on TNN and MTV. And then we know that originally the idea was going to be that the controlling interest in the league was going to be sent to Fusion Media Ventures. And that the hope would be wrestling would continue on TNT and TBS for years to come. Everything had changed 2 weeks prior, in March of 2001, when Jamie Kellner, the chief executive of WB Network, became the head of TBS. The executive said Mr. Kellner, in consultation with the president of Turner Entertainment, Brad Siegel, who had been a long proponent of WCW because he worked in WCW alongside Eric Bischoff, had decided that wrestling should be canceled sooner rather than later. It was the first programming move made under Mr. Kellner's leadership, an indication he wanted to attract more affluent viewers to TNT and TBS. This is in 2001. A TBS spokesperson said, quote, basically we decided that professional wrestling and its current incarnation is not consistent with the upscale brands we've built at TNT and TBS. Therefore, we will not be carrying it. And Mr. Kellner never gave a comment. At the time, TBS and TNT were consistently among the top-rated cable networks. They still are today. But they were criticized by analysts for lacking a clear identity. And at that time, WCW lost their WCW Thunder on Wednesday nights because the original was on Thursday and they moved to Wednesdays. And TNT had Nitro on Monday nights. And then a conglomeration of Eric Bischoff and other people to create Fusion Media Ventures. The cancellation basically destroyed the deal. Because without programming time, there was no need to have it. Because Fusion wasn't going to be able to find a new place or a new home to run the programming, nor have the consistent deal that they had with Turner Media at the time. At the end of the story, there was speculation that the World Wrestling Federation would buy its rival, but a WWF spokesperson had no comment. This was New York Times, March 19, 2001. Another thing I got to make mention of is that there was some interesting stories that were done by SlamWrestling.net back at that time where they really did go through and talk about the end of an era on TBS. The importance of AEW getting to this channel once again. And the history that comes with this channel. It's something very significant. The way I look at it. So SlamWrestling.net did a 3-part series called The End of an Era on TBS. And they went through, and John Molinaro, who wrote here, put out a lot of different stories when it came to the legacy that was left behind by TBS. At the time in 1972, the show was taped in the TBS TV studios in downtown Atlanta. Each week, Gordon Solie opened the program welcoming millions of wrestling fans with his famous refrain, "When you see this symbol pointing to the NWA emblem, you are assured of the optimum in professional wrestling." And I can't do that voice any justice. The guy was great. Good old Gordon wasn't lying. Georgia Championship Wrestling was the holy grail of wrestling TV programs. The first nationally broadcasted wrestling program in the U.S. Vince McMahon can't claim that. The show revolutionized how wrestling was presented on television, laid the groundwork for shows like Nitro, Raw, and SmackDown to follow the 2-hour format, episodic formatting, well-timed commercial breaks, cliffhanger endings, ring entrances accompanied by rock music, strong main events, major angles that led to the big payoff matches down the road. He's right. The modern format of professional wrestling that we see today is not even world-class championship wrestling, which did make changes to the way wrestling was shot and presented, sure. But TBS also had that first. That was Ted Turner, under his tutelage. A small TV studio, a handful of fans, 3 cameras, 1 ring, 1 microphone, that brown backdrop with the TBS call letters, and the NWA symbol on it that stood behind the interview podium, Gordon Solie. This is indicative of what Billy Corgan has recreated with NWA Power, which is why we enjoyed the way that show is presented today. A generation of wrestling fans grew up and lost our innocence watching Georgia Championship Wrestling. It was a part of our lives. To many, the stately Gordon Solie was like a favorite uncle. Every Saturday evening, we invited them into our home. Every Saturday, they brought us a little bit of magic. There's so much that can be said, which he goes into, and I will go and put this out there so people can look at this from the show notes. You can look and go back. In 1976, WTCG's lineup, which would then later be WTBS, would include Best of Georgia Championship Wrestling on Sunday afternoons. And in the fall of 1979, Georgia Championship Wrestling became the first wrestling television show broadcast across the country on cable as Superstation WTBS. The program became such a cult favorite that no matter where they lived, wrestling fans made sure they were in front of a TV set at 6:05 every Saturday night for 2 hours. Jim Ross talked to Dave Meltzer and the Wrestling Observer newsletter in July 2000 saying, quote, "I used to drive 60 miles over to the nearest town because we didn't have cable where we grew up. No matter where I was on Saturday, I tried to watch that show." By 1981, then renamed World Championship Wrestling was drawing on average a 6.4 rating on Saturday nights, the most watched show at that time on cable television. But as Georgia Championship Wrestling reached incredible levels of popularity, it would start to slide. Changes in booking, the show started running in different states, and the process of going to cities that had been a part of their house show circuit for years. Then we had the issue of Black Saturday, which TBS, this channel, this time slot, the air time, maybe not 6:05 Eastern on Saturdays, but the fact that TBS was a ground for a broadcasting war where both promotions were at battle. There was an issue with the Georgia promoters, which had the time slot, the access to the time slot. Ole Anderson was part of that. Majority stockholders Jim Barnett, Jack and Jerry Briscoe. They sold controlling interest in the company to Vince McMahon Jr. January 14th, on a Saturday, 1984, the WWF would debut on TBS because McMahon closed Georgia Championship Wrestling and assumed the company's TV contract, bringing the WWF to Ted Turner's TBS. In one fell swoop, 12 years of quality wrestling on TBS went straight down the drain. McMahon, with TV clearances on TBS and the USA Network, suddenly seemed poised to dominate wrestling. We've heard it ever since called Black Saturday. The fact that TBS actually ran the WWF and the fans always wanted to have that alternative. And the fact that they saw the WWF, if they were watching cable, they didn't want to watch World Wrestling Federation. It wasn't their style of wrestling. It was not indicative to the old school wrestling that we've watched prior to that. Because World Wrestling Federation was always a different style. That's why Vince McMahon had it. I'm not saying it wasn't good. It was different. We like competition. We like variations of sports. That's what it is. It's as if time has stood still. Because Vince McMahon, his spirit, hey man, bless him for being such a stubborn mule as he is. Within days after the first airing on TBS, thousands of phone calls jammed the station switchboards from irate viewers demanding that Georgia Championship Wrestling be brought back. Fans started a national campaign to get Georgia Championship Wrestling back on the air, as thousands of cards and letters flooded into TBS, telling them to kick the WWF off the air. McMahon got word of the complaints, and he told the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, quote, "We'll show those complainers the difference between a major league and a minor league production given time." Wow. Vince McMahon at that time was throwing down his dominance on everybody because he was able to buy out some competition, buy a prime time slot as a result, and take it over. And then after the complaints poured in, TBS decided to offer, 2 weeks later after the WWF debuted, they offered a 7:30 a.m. time slot to Ole Anderson's upstart Championship Wrestling from from Georgia. Gordon Solie was brought back for play-by-play announcing, and everybody seemed at peace for a while. Now, McMahon was upset about it. He reneged on the deal he had with Turner to produce a separate weekly TV program that was to be taped at TBS's studios. Instead, McMahon aired tapes of his other syndicated WWF programs. And then more of the Turner-McMahon relationship began to fall apart because Turner, upset with low ratings by the World Wrestling Federation on TBS, they gave a 1-hour Sunday evening time slot to Bill Watts' Mid-South Wrestling. Hosted by a much younger Jim Ross, Mid-South Wrestling drew better ratings than the WWF by its second week on TBS. McMahon and Turner came to an agreement as McMahon sold the right to his time slots on TBS to Jim Crockett Jr. for $1 million. As we know, that $1 million most likely helped to fund the first ever WrestleMania. So the Crockett's would come in, and here we were. Take out McMahon, Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage, Hillbilly Jim, the British Bulldogs, and Gene Okerlund. Enter Crockett, Ric Flair, Dusty Rhodes, the Four Horsemen, the Road Warriors, the Midnight Express, and Tony Schiavone. Next story they brought up after that was second part of the story from Slam Wrestling was the story of the Superstation. There's just something to be said growing up as a kid watching TBS that was so much fun. Watching the Atlanta Braves, which were a horrible team when I used to watch them, but I was such a big fan of theirs. Turner never forgetting how much wrestling helped out the station as a result. As mentioned before in a later story, Mid-South Championship Wrestling was on TBS for 15 weeks, and it did outdraw the WWF. Can't say that happens now, but that was something to be said about that. They also made a mention about WCW's Clash of the Champions 20 from Atlanta in the fall of 1992, celebrating 20 years of wrestling on TBS. Live card, historic clips throughout the show. TBS brought back many of the stars in the 70s that helped make wrestling TBS such a tradition. It was at this show that Andre the Giant made his last public appearance before passing away in January of 93. Now, John goes through so much here. Clash of the Champions on TBS, the first one they had Flair and Sting to a 45-minute draw. Great stuff. Then you had Steamboat and Flair, best 2 out of 3 falls match. Clash of the Champions 6, 55 minutes, one of the greatest wrestling matches to ever air on TBS. He says it's Imagine Steamboat Savage at WrestleMania 3, only 10 times better. So to conclude my point about this move to TBS, of course TBS is not the same network. And that's okay. But I really do appreciate, more than anything else, this is where you have to give the credit where credit's due. Regardless of what you think of the brand, that Tony Khan, along with the EVPs and the whole setup of All Elite Wrestling, to be able to go ahead and create a company that it was able to restore a once truly broken relationship with a major media giant, which was attached to Turner Sports, attached to Warner Media, attached to AT&T, previously attached to AOL, now attached soon to Discovery Communications, to be roughly the second largest media conglomerate in the country, or in the world for that matter. For this promotion to be able to get to where they did, it's incredible. It's groundbreaking. It's trend-setting. Now, it's only because of the relationship that TBS had with wrestling decades ago that really makes this so symbolic for wrestling fans like myself, makes it such an important thing. It's so incredible. But I will also say that Tony Khan has to get a lot of credit. I give him a lot of credit for what he's done, for this relationship to be fostered. Because AEW doesn't get the success it has, or the opportunity to be as successful as it has, if not for the deal they got with TNT. When I heard that happen, I was like, oh, they might get on Destination America or some other defunct channel. You know, they'll do something like where Impact Wrestling get on the Pursuit. No, these guys got TNT off the bat. Crazy. It was amazing to hear that. And they have done well ever since. They've overcome the NXT onslaught. They've overcome everything. And now this company is positioned to now expand its programming offerings So they are the full-fledged. It's not just a 2-hour show. It's not just their YouTube shows. Now they have 3 hours of primetime programming on cable. Coming up in August, they will have 3 hours. They will have their second show. It's really incredible. Now, I don't know what this means for Dark and Dark Elevation, but we don't know what the new Rampage show is going to be, but we're going to have some time to find that out. The other thing that's very smart as well is it's an hour-long show. It's not an extra 2-hour show they have to fill. They're not going to do what Raw and SmackDown is, because right now, WWE is already struggling to keep 5 hours afloat of good quality programming. They do a much better job of SmackDown because it's a shorter show. Raw, you have to really think about the fact that Raw would be really tough to program in the first place to keep that compelling for 3 hours straight. The only time it really worked well was when they still had, would have really worked well was back before when they had competition. But now, we could talk about WWE another day. I know we always do anyway. This is the off season. We'll have more than plenty of enough times to talk about them. But this move means so much. And I'm proud of what All Elite Wrestling's done at this point to get so far. They made it. They were able to go ahead and survive so much here of an onslaught with so many changes on such a large corporate media giant. Because Warner Media is susceptible. We didn't know what was going to happen. AT&T came in. Warner Media was left alone to their own device. Remember, we had the president of the company at TNT, the guy that was there before, who left. And making sure that when that relationship was gone, that Tony Khan and the team were able to go and continue to foster relationships with Warner Media and with Turner Networks to be able to go and keep that relationship strong. Which is more than I can say that what Eric Bischoff was able to do. Eric Bischoff facilitated the move, but to keep it consistent was another story. And they were able to do that. Like Tony Khan right now, we need to give him a bit of gratitude for what he's done. He deserves it. This has been really good. And this is regardless of what you think about AEW. Remember this. I will say it over and over since I said the beginning of this series in December 18, 2012. Competition is good for wrestling. We want AEW to succeed because not only will we have another great wrestling promotion to watch, an alternative to programming, which is why AEW came out in the first place. Because of the mistakes and the sins of WWE. But that, more importantly, WWE, when given competition, they have to step up, feel another company breathing down their neck, another company in their rear view mirror, and say, oh shit, we need to make some changes. Vince McMahon will not accept being second best. He refuses it. As one thing we know about that old man, that's one thing he will not allow. He will not tolerate second place. He will not be the number 2 promotion. He will do whatever it takes to take that top spot back because he earned it. He got it there. He doesn't want to lose it. As long as he's got air in his lungs, he'll keep doing that. And I'm sure that Triple H and Stephanie and Shane and whoever else is running that company and Nick Khan, the other Khan, they want to keep in their top spot as well. But AEW now is putting WWE on notice. It doesn't reflect on Raw. SmackDown, they're doing better. The Backlash show wasn't bad, but we know they're making some mistakes, and some of the things they're doing are just off. This competition, this push by AEW, forcing up live shows first, this broadcast deal coming into play, getting a new program out there, this all has to be concerning to WWE and to Vince McMahon himself. He's going to read that. His shareholders are going to read that. What are they going to think? he has to have a good response. A couple of things I want to bring up before we go ahead and wrap things up. A few loose ends that have come up since we talked. Well, only a couple of days ago. Drake Wuertz, a referee from NXT, reportedly was almost beat up, walked out of a Triple H meeting about inclusion, and there was some nuclear heat backstage at NXT. So referee got himself into a really big issue. Fightful.com reporting that he had, quote, had nuclear heat brought on by himself. He was warned by WWE about attending events without a mask. And there were attempts for political plays where he tried to position himself for certain roles in the company. That he was willing to put heat on others several times in order to get what he wanted. There was an issue where the wrestler, now we know him as Ezra Judge, almost got physical with Wuertz, and there were numerous instances where NXT higher-ups were alerted to issues that Wuertz had with people of color. Now, last year, Wuertz backstage had some heat following the NXT TakeOver In Your House show. Triple H gave a speech about Black Lives Matter. Triple H talked about all people of different races and religions being welcomed, and once religions were mentioned, Wuertz aggressively gathered his stuff and left. And several wrestlers in the company said they were uncomfortable around him. He was said to have been loudly critical of wrestlers getting vaccinated, even for simple flu shots. So there's a political stance on that, and Drake Wuertz, he's going to die on that. He's going to die on that hill for whatever kind of beliefs he has, but he lost his job, and that kind of stuff doesn't look good for NXT and doesn't need to be happening back there. So there's that part. I don't have much to say about that. I'm sure some of my podcast brethren will probably have their own political views to bring up and say something. Oh, this guy's, part of like QAnon or some other. I get it. Yeah, I got it. I'm not talking about politics or, major news events like that. I don't need to. Black Lives Matter, no opinion. Don't ask me about it. I don't need to go and say. It's not for me to say. You're not coming to the show for that. So if you want to hear about that and Drake Wuertz and him being some kind of a, non-anti-vax or whatever, yeah, go to another show. You're not hearing about that here. I could care less. NXT drawing 700,000 viewers. And that's after Bronson Reed won the North American title inside of a steel cage. Tony Storm and Zoe Stark had a match. Ted DiBiase Sr. Confronting Cameron Grimes. Then you had another appearance by Hit Row, among other things. So NXT is still in a pretty consistent spot. Their show is still pretty well done. They do properly promote matches. They do give us some good things on the show. I like their presentation. And I think they're not doing too bad in terms of trying to develop stars there. But it's going to be not enough, at least at this point. I still think there's some that can be said. There are some stars who are going to get the kind of treatment that will resonate over to the main roster. I think Karrion Kross is the best example of that. I don't see where Cameron Grimes and the amount of time they give him is going to resonate well going over into the main roster. I think it'll just become a joke if they use that character and move it to the main roster. But the stuff they're doing in NXT is pretty good. Legado del Fantasma, no matter how good they are, they might just become the new incarnation of Lucha House Party or Retribution for all I care. Because you have to overcome. And Hit Row, if you put that on the Raw roster, remember this. Anybody right now on NXT, they're going to get thrown into Raw. They're not going to go on SmackDown. Not at all. So you have to hope that whatever goes on NXT, this is the hope we have for Raw. There will always be some stars here that can resonate over to the main roster, overcome any creative issues that Raw and their team will come up with to really screw the pooch on these stars. Look what they've done with Keith Lee, with Aleister Black, with Matt Riddle. It doesn't always work well, but you have to consider what's going on. Rhea Ripley, another example of which stars make it over and how well they crash and burn. No matter how well received they were in NXT, will they fall apart when they go to Raw? Because we know Raw is where a lot of NXT stars are going there to crash and burn. And it can't completely say it's their fault, but NXT has to be able to go and put a character together so solid and so over that it's going to be impossible for the folks on Raw to screw it up. Just keep that in mind. Would Bronson Reed do well in Raw? Would Johnny Gargano and The Way do well on Raw? Will Adam Cole do well on Raw? Ciampa Thatcher, Cameron Grimes, the Robert Stone brand. Do you think any of these acts would make it over to Raw and get over and bring the ratings over above 2 million? Do any of them have that kind of power? Karrion Kross does. Finn Balor, if you wanted to go back, I think you would add to the mix as well. But I think Karrion Kross is a game changer. I said that. And that any time, no matter what they do now, they could absolutely go ahead and bump him up to the main roster and put him on Raw, because that's the place he'll be. But I don't know. I think that's going to be the decision that's going to have to be made down the line, because the copy and paste moves that Raw has right now are not helping matters much. Something needs to happen down the line. We had more matches announced for AEW Double or Nothing coming up next weekend, Sunday, May 30th. Right now we have scheduled AEW World Championship 3-way match, Kenny Omega versus Pac versus Orange Cassidy. Women's World Championship, Hikaru Shida defends her title against Britt Baker, DMD, Dr. Britt Baker. Miro defends the TNT Championship versus Lance Archer. Are they going to rename that the TBS Championship come January? I think they should. Casino Battle Royale. So far, we know that Christian, Matt Sydal, Evil Uno, Colt Cabana, Mark Quinn, Isaiah Cassidy, Powerhouse Hobbs, and Jungle Boy will be competing. Hangman Page versus Brian Cage. We now know that we will have the AEW World Tag Team Championship. Young Bucks will defend against Jon Moxley and Eddie Kingston. And we will have the Stadium Stampede, the Inner Circle versus the Pinnacle. That's just a stacked show across the board. There's not a bad show on the card. There is not a bad show. It's wonderful. So I like where we're going with that. Next week, we will do preview predictions for Double or Nothing. And we'll just keep an eye on a few other things that are going on. In the meantime, thank you for listening to the program, as you always do. I hope you enjoyed a little bit of that that roll down memory lane, talking about all this with AEW. Moving to the Superstation, TBS. Can't wait. But until then, we'll come back for another Wrestling is Real podcast next week, because wrestling needs us. Thank you for listening to the Wrestling is Real podcast. You can find all previous episodes at WrestlingIsReal.com or subscribe to the show on all major podcast outlets, including Apple, Amazon, Google, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Follow the King of Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at King of Podcasts, and search King of Podcasts on YouTube, or type youtube.com/JBRASCO951. This has been a presentation of the King of Podcasts Radio Network.